A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakodash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth and citations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. Okay, my name is Brother Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will as always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I just wanted to discuss, I guess, a little bit of exhortation in regards to self-esteem. And a lot of our self-esteem has been broken down, because we come from a dysfunctional family, right? And a lot of us, for example, come from families where what happens, there is a lack of a father presence in the household, and then there is an upliftment, I'm sorry, of the mother. So what does that lead to? Situations where, she is trying to govern a household and she can't do that, right? But through the philosophies of the serpent, she's been bamboozled to think that she can do that. And it leads to a lot of poor decision making, right? So it leads to certain things like unnecessary discipline. So discipline that's not essentially required, right? And then also it can lead to other situations where there was tension between the father and the son. I'm sorry, the father and the mother, and it trickles down onto the son. So, for example, there might be tension between the father and the mother, and there are certain situations she might have been overly emotional, and then, they say certain things like, oh, your father neglected you, your father is a piece of shit, and that helps to foster bad seeds of essentially, I don't want to say wickedness, but it can foster an unhealthy relationship and how we see, male authority, or how we see our own fathers, right? So what I wanted to do is to kind of like expound a little bit on that today, and pretty much the end result is is pretty much cultivating, recognizing these problems, right? Because the truth is a place where we're being cleansed. We're being cleansed through the word, right? And the word is Yahweh Shai, because he comes in the volume of the book, right? Because as a matter of fact, let me start off with that, right? Because as I was having this discussion with a brother, I was thinking to myself, you know, um, even though those things are unfortunate that these things happen, another aspect also to look at some of these things also is that if these things never happened, would there be need for a physician, right? So this is Psalms 119, verse 9, and it says, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed to according to thy word, right? So, the scriptures is how, we're being healed and how we're being cleansed. And then there's something that Yahushua also said. Hold on, let me get that too. I was going to get that after, but, since I'm kind of on that point right now, this is Luke chapter 5, verse 31. As a matter of fact, outside of 30, and it says, but the scribes and the Pharisees murmured against his disciples, saying, why do ye eat and drink and with publicans and sinners? Yahushua answering and said unto them, they that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance, right? So, if we were whole and didn't have these situations that we went through, there is really no need, for a savior to kind of come back and bind us up, right? Because if you think about it on a practical level, the only reason, I'm not saying brothers go to the doctor, but I'm just saying let's just say, for example, you went to a doctor. What is the reason you go to a doctor? You go to a doctor because you're experiencing some type of ailment. You're going to a doctor because you need some type of ointment, you need some type of medication, you need something to help bind you up because you're in pain, or you have some kind of trauma, or you have something going on that you need healing from. That's the importance of Yahweh Shai, right? Because he is that physician. Now, not to take away from the actual main topic of the lesson, which pretty much revolves around low self-esteem and being mindful of women's words and their sentiments of essentially wickedness, right? Because a lot of their behaviors trickles down and it can affect your own self-esteem also. I'm speaking more specifically about mothers, right? Because Jake has a very close attachment to mothers. We really do have a very strong attachment to our mothers, right? So one of the things that can occur is that through this dysfunctional family is the fact that you have an upliftment of the mother, through those different philosophies of the serpent and so on and so forth. And now it leads to certain poor decision making. So there's probably tension between the mother and the father, right? And then that trickles down on the son, and the son starts to internalize those comments, those words, right? Those words that were being, that essentially are not, don't see the father in a positive light, right? So it doesn't paint the father in a positive light. So it kind of essentially, he starts to internalize these things and start to feel like, like you ain't shit either. And a lot of us grew up like that, thinking, well, we ain't shit. Black men ain't shit. You know what I'm saying? The Israelite man ain't shit. I know our society, especially in Babylon, it does not care about the welfare of the Israelite man. It strongly doesn't, or especially the sons. But there's different different avenues and areas I want to tackle. So just bear with me as I kind of try and piece this all together and bring this all out. So just bear with me on this. This is Job chapter 39. I'm sorry, 1 second. Verse 17. And it says, but the Most High Yahweh hath deprived her of wisdom, and neither hath he imparted her understanding. So the Lord doesn't give, the women understanding. There's a ranking file, that the Heavenly Father, set up, and Paul describes that in First Corinthians 11, right? So this is why they're not supposed to be in positions of leadership in the first place, right? And that, and including that in the household, and we see the dire consequences of that, and essentially it has led to a lot of, sometimes, there might be very decisions that were made very in an emotional sense, executing discipline when it wasn't necessary upon a child, right? Or taking the anger out on essentially that she might have experienced from the father, whatever the situation was between her and the father, and then that energy gets transferred onto the child. So the child is now growing up having a strong sense of resentment, having a strong sense of bitterness, having a poor self-image, right? We don't, and then to add to that, you have certain, and Esau essentially adds to that too, because when we look at media, what do you see on media about the portrayal of the Israelite man? You see essentially, you also see Yahweh Shai being X'd out, right? Being painted as a so-called white person. But you also see, the father is being portrayed in a negative light. You don't see an image of honor, an image of discipline, or an image that is respectable. You see a very clownish, cartoonish, sodomitish sort of image of the Israelite man. And you see that within the men of our nation, right? So the Lord didn't put, the women to be in those sorts of positions, right? You know, it's very important, for her to, teach the children in righteousness. This is Titus chapter 2, verse 4, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of the Most High Yahweh Bashmel Shai be not blasphemed. Right? So it's essentially giving here a rubric of how a woman is supposed to be, right? And one of the things that a lot of our women, subscribe to, especially our moms, is that those philosophies of the serpent, thinking that, because you can raise children on your own, it doesn't mean that's the right way to do so. And we're seeing the detrimental consequences of that, and then you have children that are essentially running amok in the streets, smashing jewelry stores, being overly emotional when it comes to dealing with police situations. Of course, some of those situations are unjust. Well, let me put it this way. Some of those situations are, Esau uses, his sword, but the point is that, there's a way, children are supposed to, be taught in a certain, they're supposed to even be taught about their own history, right? You're supposed to learn good things, especially not about, about your father and your forefathers. The scriptures say that let us remember the famous men, that begat us, to roughly paraphrase. Let us inquire of the way of our forefathers. And we're living in a time where, when it comes to remembering or thinking about the ways of our fathers, Jake doesn't think about that or disregard that. When it comes to male authority, Jake disregards, that importance. They're not seen as, they don't recognize the value of being schooled in essentially righteousness, with our apostles and elders on down, right? But you see a sentiment, there's a strong distaste for the way they think about fathers and elders and so on and so forth, right? Let me read this again. Hold on. This is, 1 second. Verse 4, it says that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, and to love their children. So, your children should be indoctrinated in the ways of righteousness, knowing the ways of their forefathers and the things their forefathers did, in particular situations, right? These precepts and understanding, right? That's one of the things that, before King David passed, he passed on, godly counsel onto his child, right? That's one of the things a mother should be doing, to her child when they're at a really, really young age. You're not supposed to be sowing seeds of contention, sowing seeds of what's it called, resentment, misery, to see your own father in a bad light, because what does that result in? It results in an unhealthy relationship with the father, and it results in a low self-esteem in yourself. So this is a couple things just to keep in mind, right? I'm kind of tackling a couple points here and there. Esau has a hand in this, yes. Our mothers have a hand in this, right? And also another part of it all kind of like, it takes a toll in the way you see yourself, right? So that's why we're, being brought back to this understanding and knowing the ways of our forefathers, we don't walk with that stigma. But it's something good to also recognize these things, right? So we don't get weighed down, we don't get condemned in our conscience because of those things, right? Because we're going through that healing process at the same time, right? So let me go to the Apocrypha 1 second. Okay, I'll read this here. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 25, verse 19. And it says, all wickedness is but a little to the wickedness of a woman. Let a portion of a sinner fall upon her. And I'm reading this also because another thing that a lot of mothers do also is the fact that and there's been stories about this also, where she will pit the child against the father, right, in order to extract resources from the father. This is why she's not to be in control of the household. She's not supposed to be running the household, because this is the kinds of things that they will do, right? And then, you might have a father that's actually trying to do the right thing, but the end result is, okay, and then you have Esau in the hand in it, because they're married according to Esau's world, right? So Esau's in the hand of this, right? And then you end up in situations and certain unrighteous decrees where they have to pay child support for children, and sometimes even also the children are not always theirs, right? So these are examples of wicked things that mothers can do, and it can lead to low self-esteem upon you. So just something to be able to recognize, right? Because coming back into this understanding, we recognize that you are not the neglected child that she might have said. Whatever words that she said, it's a battle, but those words, we have to go back to the scriptures and remember to understand that we are a righteous and a holy people. We come from a holy stock of people. We're not just a bunch of low life, niggas, pookies, and ray-rays that are portrayed in Esau's media, right? We have to fight against these things, right? It's contrary. The spirit warreth against the flesh, right? And the flesh against the spirit, right? You recall a lot of these things that maybe your mom told you, when you were younger, and those things put a dampen on your self-esteem, right? And then Satan uses that to get a foothold into your mind. So that's why I'm also discussing this, because it also affects the way you think about yourself. We're not supposed to think about ourselves as a lowly, pathetic group of people. We're supposed to walk uprightly and think of ourselves as princes, right? Let me get Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, and it says, for thou art a holy people unto the Lord Yahweh thy power, and the Lord thy power hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, a above all the people that are upon the face of the earth, right? So there is nobody on this earth that is like us, that is as talented as us. You go back into the ways of our forefathers, man. You know, they were, they had, exceptional, wisdom, knowledge, in even in different captivities. When you go through Daniel, the seventh chapter, there were different cases where you had our forefathers and they stood out. They made that kingdom great, because of they were, whoever it was, they were so nigh unto the Lord. Like, I'll just use Daniel as an example, because the scriptures say the Lord he had essentially like an excellent spirit upon him, So these are the things we have to remember, when you're having those moments of low self-esteem, right? Because that trickles down because of familial issues. And a mother could be an example, but it could have probably been another parent also. It could have been a father too, right? But this is something that that is very much prevalent within our culture, because we grew up in, a lot of us come from homes that are essentially single mother homes. There was a show I used to watch back in the day called Beyond Scared Straight, and a lot of the times the Israelite children that went to the jails, the majority of them came from households that was just run by single mothers, right? The father wasn't around, and if the father was there, he was very, very laid back, right? And another thing example is if the father was quote unquote there, the father was they were a bad example, right? So pretty much I would just like to sum up is the fact that we're healing at the end of the day, right? Okay, let's go to okay, this is First Peter's 2, verse 9. And it says, "Ye are a chosen generation and a royal priesthood, a holy nation and a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him that called you from the darkness into his marvelous light." Right? So remembering these things, right? Remembering these things, being a holy, because we're a holy people. Holy means separate, and we're above these other nations, right? This, one came out stronger than the other, right? We are the stronger nation, and those are the things that, when you're young, these are the kind of stories, like when you read about kings and the righteous kings and so on and so forth, we should be hearing those things as a child, right? The scriptures say, train up a child in the way that it should go, right? Those are the kinds of things that we should hear, right? As a young child, right? But we didn't hear a lot of those things. So we fell victim, essentially, yes, we were under the curses and we discontinued from a heritage. But these are the sorts of things that we should hear as a child, those stories, knowing those stories where the Lord pulled through for us. You know what I'm saying? So, that's pretty much it. I kind of just wanted to discuss, it's to sum it all up. Low self-esteem, one of the avenues it can come from is from a dysfunctional family where you have the mother that is uplifted and the father is non-existent. That is pretty much another avenue. And through different situational occurrences that have happened, certain things could have happened to you within your childhood, which led to having a very broken sense of self-esteem about you, right? But those are thoughts we have to fight off, right? And those are things that, we have to remember that we're a special holy people unto the Lord Yahweh Bashim El Shai, right? So I'll end it off there, but Lord's words was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.